excited to have you here for the Pulling It All Together from Poems to Publishable Books event. Before we begin, I would like to go over some brief housekeeping. Please note that this event will be recorded. If you are uncomfortable with being recorded or do not want your face to be shown, please feel free to turn off your video as well as keep yourself muted. We will begin recording now. We at Mass Poetry are intentional about ensuring that events are accessible to everyone attending and involved in the festival. We have closed captions available for this event. If you can't see them, you can turn them on by clicking the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and then show subtitles. If you would like to turn them off, you can choose hide subtitles. For anyone who is depending on auto captions today, to ensure chat messages are not popping up over the captioning, click on chat at the bottom of the screen and it will open a chat panel to the right. If you experience any trouble with this or have any other logistics, please send a private chat message to myself or Jen Martelli. Regarding Zoom etiquette, please ensure you keep yourself muted unless you are invited to unmute by the speakers. There are many ways to interact with each other via the chat and the Zoom reactions button, so please feel free to use them as a way to engage. Please be kind and respectful to the event producers and your fellow participants. We will remove participants for discriminatory or harassing comments, and in such cases, participants may be banned from further festival participation. Thank you for your patience, and we hope you enjoy the event.
Thank you all for coming. Welcome to Lynn's and my workshop. And I'm just wanted to mention that I'm talking to y'all from a log cabin in New Hampshire with flowers in the background. And I want to introduce myself. I teach writing at Wellesley College, and I have taught at Harvard and Penn State and also University of Michigan. And I've kind of journeyed from being an academic to a mid-career detour as a poet, and that's what I'm going to talk with you about today. I've published my 10th book of poems will be coming out this summer, and I started in 2010, so it's been an exciting ride. And I also write a poem a day, so I'm up to like 6,700 poems. I've been doing that since 2003. So I'm going to talk with you today about how I have made this, how I take this vast amount of material and try to sculpt it into books. And there's a method behind my madness. So I think that's it for me for now. And Lynn?
My name is Lynn Vitti. I am also a teacher of poetry and also of many other kinds of writing, and taught for many years at Wellesley College, where I taught the expository writing class and some more journalistic classes to juniors and seniors, focusing on bioethics. That doesn't sound like it has much to do with poetry, and it doesn't. So that's my other life. So I have also been late to poetry, but much later than Heather because I'm older than Heather. And I had been a closet poet for many years, and my first chapbook was published in 2017. I followed that up with another one in 2018. My first full-length collection was published last October by Apprentice House Press of Loyola, Maryland. And I've published lots of individual poems in journals, probably about 150 at this point. So my focus at this point is on shaping a new full-length collection. And that's one of the things that I want to talk about today, because my journey from publishing here and there to pulling together a whole collection was pretty arduous. And I learned a lot along the way about how to figure out how to design your manuscript so that a publisher will publish it. Our contact information should be in the chat. If we don't answer questions that you have during this session, please feel free to get in touch with one or both of us, because we always don't have the same answer to your question. But we would very much like to hear from you, and at the end we hope we'll have time for questions. So I'm going to talk briefly about the difference between a chapbook and a full-length collection. And this may be too elementary for some people, but we wanted to deal with issues and questions that novices have, as well as more experienced writers. And some of you may already have a chapbook or a publication, so this may be review. Generally, a chapbook is shorter. It can be as short as 16 or 20 pages for some small publishers, up to about 40, 42 pages. It really depends on the publisher. If you're entering contests for which have publication as one of the prizes, the guidelines are almost always very specific as to the minimum and the maximum. And it's important to stick to those because it has to do with their printing, it has to do with pagination, it has to do with how the pages come in fours in some cases. So it's important to think about those differences. If you have 100 poems, then you may want to start thinking about a full length from the get-go. There's no rule that says you have to start with a chapbook. But for most of us, chapbook, putting it together is less daunting, and to find a unifying theme for a chapbook is usually not as complicated as doing so for a full-length book. I think I just want to talk a little bit about formatting, because this is really important. One quick way to get your manuscript disregarded is not to follow that contest rule set by a publisher or that particular small publishing house's rules on what they want to see. Some ask for a title page without the author's name on it. Some ask for a title page with the author's name on it. Many ask for 2 title pages, one with the author's name and the title, one without. And I think probably at this point, not all, but maybe 80% of publishers and contests use a submissions manager, either their own, which you have to register for and put in your email and give your snail mail address and so on, or through Submittable. And if you've never used Submittable, go to submittable.com as soon as this workshop is over and register, because first of all, it makes submission very easy. And it also allows you to submit to places that say simultaneous submissions are okay with us, and keep track of everything, because keeping track, once you start sending the same manuscript to different places that say it's okay to send it to us even if you send it to someone else, it can get very messy. You do not want to be in a position of having it accepted by one when you've already accepted somebody else's invitation to go to the prom. So I think the other good thing about Submittable is it now lists calls for submissions by publishers. It lists contests. And I think so it's important to do that. Another really good resource is Poets and Writers organization, pw.org, which will list contests and calls for publications, but particularly segregates chapbook contests from full lengths, and also does it by calendar and deadline. So it helps you, so let's say it's now almost the end of May, you could look and see what's coming up in terms of deadline for June, July, August, September, and calendar that for yourself in your own calendar, and then sort of think about that, what you might want to aim for, depending on how many poems you have now and how organized you are and how much time you have. I think that's all I have right now, and I think Heather's going to talk about an interesting and essential part of a manuscript. If you have published any of those poems, even one, that you submit in a manuscript before, and that's acknowledgments. So,
yeah, so there's really, there's like what Lynn was saying, there's the logistics of like finding out the pages and all of those things. And then there's more artistic design concepts, which we'll talk about later. We both have some responses for that. And then there's this kind of strategy as well, which part of it is, looking at the contest, looking at where your work might fit, but building on your successes. So for example, I published one poem in 2007, like one. I sent out a lot more than that, and I published one. And a friend of mine saw it, like someone I never thought would read that journal. I didn't tell anyone, and wrote to me and said, "Oh my gosh, you should do some more." And I was like, wow, like somebody actually read my poem. It got published. So, rejection, sending things out, strategizing how much you send out. Don't be discouraged. Like if you send out 10 things and they all come back, send them somewhere else. But once you do get something in print, you can build on that really easily. So for example, my first chapbook, which is arranged around the seasons of the year, I included this summer poem that I'd published. And I was able to say in the acknowledgments, this poem was published in, it was an anthology in Colorado called In Other Words. And then you have that line. So you try to build on that. So I've tried to maximize my successes. So when I send out a book of poems now, I often try to include, I always try to include a few poems that have been previously published, not a lot. You don't want to recycle stuff constantly, but like a targeted few. So then my acknowledgements page looks pretty long, right? Like it's got, journals, then it was published in this book, and then it was published there. And there's like a self-serving reason, which is that you want to try to make it look like you've published a whole lot of stuff. But it's also a way of kind of sharing. So people who like your work can look at those things. So if you have a poet that you really like, you can look at their acknowledgements and see where they send stuff out and see if your work kind of resonates with their work. So the acknowledgements are actually really, really huge. It's very important to acknowledge your work and where it's been published, and if it's been published in different versions. I know sometimes I have trouble. I change poems on the fly, and then I'm like, I don't know which version that went to where. So, but the acknowledgements, so you have the title page that Lynn talked about. You have the acknowledgements, and that's another really important part of the process.
I think there are a few publishers who will actually say, and I think they're in the minority, we want at least 50% of your manuscript to have been previously published in journals. So just be aware of that, because if you don't have them, then you might as well not just skip and go on to the next publisher or the next contest. So I would like to talk about what you do. Let's say you have 45 poems and you've decided, or let's say you have 120 poems and you've decided you want to put these together into a collection. And once you get it all spiffed up, then you're going to send it out. But what do you do at the very beginning? You've got all these poems. Some of them seem to be related to each other. They may be about a certain person. They may be a certain genre. I have Sharon Olds' book, which Heather gave me, Odes, which is in hardback, like 80 pages of odes. So this is all the same form, right? Or something like Shakespeare's sonnets or sonnets from the Portuguese, all one form. But most of us don't write 100 sonnets. We may play around with sonnets, but we also have more free verse and so on, or we might write a sestina, but it's not a book of sestinas. So how are those poems connected? That is probably the biggest challenge when you're designing a collection. I would say save your title to last. I would sort of put that at the end of the to-do list and read through those poems and think about themes that you see coming up. Jot down some notes. But then comes what is a very old-fashioned, very old school 1965 way of putting your collection together, and it's called claiming some physical space in your home, or if you have access to a library table or something when we get back to the library. I do it on the floor in my study, which is I clear everything I can to the corners, and I printed up all of my poems and I start to lay them out on the floor. I close the door so the cat doesn't come in and disrupt what's going on. I make sure that the window is not wide open if it's windy, because your order will get destroyed. And you put those papers down and you start to look at the first line and look at the last line and see connections. Is there something in this poem that seems to naturally lead to that poem over there? Move that one over there next to this one. And you start to really interrogate what those themes are, what words or phrases echo one another, what forms seem related to each other, what forms are so much alike you want to separate them from each other. And that often can take days. And if you have the space undisturbed, maybe even longer. I think that the next thing to decide, and we're going to give you some examples of this from our own work, is what's the first poem? What is the poem you want to capture the reader with? Whether it's the reader who's going to be reading your book or the editor who's going to be accepting your book. Right off the bat, what is one of your strongest poems? You don't want to lead with something that's not really strong. I should have said, when you're laying out the poems, every once in a while you will see a poem and you think, I don't really think that's that strong of a poem. And just pull it out, put it in another pile. Maybe it needs more work, because you're going to be tempted to revise as you go along. Don't get down to the manicuring and the micro revision at this point. Just get a sense of what the poems are about and how they speak to each other, really. So once you've got your first poem, that's good, because now you're really off to the races. Now you can begin to get some sense of, what do I want the dominant tone of this collection to be? I read a beautiful collection recently by Jeffrey Harrison that he wrote. Many of the poems are about his late brother, who had previously taken his own life not long before that. And so a lot of these poems were really elegies for the brother, but they were fabulous, and some of them were quite funny, like the one about his brother was obsessed with the movie Being John Malkovich, and at one point the poet Jeffrey Harrison goes into the old Tower Records right at the very end before it closed on Newbury Street. And lo and behold, who does he see at the opposite cash register but John Malkovich? So this sets off a whole sort of poem about his brother, but it was a poem of loss, and somehow he ties it in. But there were points at which you wanted to laugh out loud at the poem. So you get that sense of, this is going to be a celebratory, fun collection. This is going to be a poem that has reverence for nature, has reverence for the sea or the mountains or the hike I took to the Himalayas or whatever. It could be poems about hiking in Sicily, but some sort of unifying topic or theme. That point, you've got to figure out what your bookend is. What do I want to end with? So you get the first and the last, and then you can deal with the challenging and arduous middle. So apropos of that, and I think I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, you might also want to divide your book into sections, especially if it's a full-length collection. Some people, and I'll give you some specifics about the ways that various poets have used sections later, but particularly, oh, thank you, An Undertaking, Jeffrey Harrison. I think that I should stop now, because Heather's going to give some examples of how she organized one of her, well, it's the forthcoming book, Orchard Days.
Yeah. So I've done a lot of different organizational schemes, and Lynn and I put out documents you can look at with our websites and all our books. So I've done some like by seasons. I did one about the end of a marriage. I did one kind of showcasing poetic form. I did one about travels in Ireland that I came up with the title poem before the collection. The title poem is James Joyce's Water Closet. And that's the title poem and the title of my book. And that, really set the tone for that collection. But I decided from my forthcoming book that I wanted to do something slightly more complicated. So it's called Orchard Days. And I used to live on an apple orchard. So guess what? That's where it comes from. But that it's also from a period in my life, a period of about 5 years that I felt like was kind of an intact piece of time. So I wanted to look at poems from those 5 years. So I also believe in the method Lynn was talking about, although I usually do it on the dining room table, which means I have to clean it up all the time, which is sort of annoying. But I decided, I printed out tons of poems from that time, a ridiculous amount. And then I started to sift and think about the ones that didn't really fit. And I wanted to have a couple of different narratives going on in the book. So I wanted to have the narrative of those years of what happened. It was when my children were young. And I wanted to have a chronicle of that time. So that's kind of, there's like a memoir piece of it, which is a narrative going forward. And then I also wanted to have the orchard be like a character in the books and to be a consistent voice. So hence the title. And another thing that I'll just mention, because we didn't really make a whole lot of room for this, the deciding what you want to put on the cover of a book, that's like a whole other conversation. But I just had this very serendipitous thing happen, which I wanted to share. So there's a painter I love in Maine called Colin Page, who has a painting of an orchard that I've always loved that's super expensive. And I just wrote to him and said, I really love your work. And I'm writing this book, and could I pay you something to use this cover? And he wrote me back right away and was like, sure, you don't need to pay me anything, just use it. And I was like, wow, I was like completely surprised. So, if you have some art or something that you really love, you might be surprised at what will happen. That's happened for me a couple of times. This is the most expensive piece of work I've ever had on a cover, but it was free to me. So, so what I did was I found the original poem, which I'm going to read you now. It's called Apples. And that was the first poem. So it's called Apples. Sometimes they say, dear, come at night to munch apples. We would pay our children pennies to pick up newly fallen ones, the ones without crunch marks. We would mash these beauties into amber-colored cider. Wasps would swarm on warm autumn days, sweetness trickling down from the red wheel of the machine we shared with our neighbor. We would fill our wheelbarrow with piles of crushed apples and take them to the woods where we would toss them. They would lie there undisturbed until the stags would wander through our forest in herds, loping through dusk to pick up the leavings. Still, the smell of apples recalls early twilight October evenings. Our years there came very close, or so I thought, to days of Eden. So that was my beginning. And I actually have a much later poem that I'm not going to read you that's called October Moonrise. So that, I was setting up, like, you want to think about the beginning poem as setting up, really the whole book and what you want to unfurl in it. So then I put in a middle poem, which is called Orchards Burning. And this is my longest collection. So it's 106 pages. So that seems like giant to me. And this one comes on page 67, just so you get a sense. So you've got the memoir theme unfurling, you've got the kids growing up, and then you have this landscape of the orchard and the town. We used to live in Harvard, Mass, which is an orchard town. So this one is called Orchards Burning. And while we lived in Harvard, the house prices doubled because that test, the MCAS, the Harvard schools came out number one. It was like absurd. Nobody ever, when we first moved there, people were like, oh, you live in Harvard? Like, where's that? And I was like, oh, you live in Harvard, that's schools. It's really kind of crazy, but that's what happens. So this one's called Orchards Burning. So the real estate was changing very dramatically while we lived there. A puff of smoke crosses the sky. Walking by, we see new green coming now. Rows of stubs, trees cut down, apple wood piles high. Blue skies stretch tight, the road turns. We linger, looking at the bonfire gathering steam. flames shooting out with wildness. A change is bound to come, but maybe it can be slow, not too jarring. So far, this town has held off a lot, but there's always a builder lurking, threatening to make clusters of houses dot the land, drawing families to set down their roots among the dwindling remaining apple trees. So you get a sense of, the tone is shifting from a sort of Edenic pastoral happiness to something suggesting, a change, and maybe not always a good change. And then the very last poem in the book is called Skidding, and it takes place when the day that we left that town and moved to central Pennsylvania, which was not a great move. So it's called Skidding. For hours now, we've been driving through rough terrain. Mountain passes begin and end, then begin again. Clouds closing in on us slowly. Our vision obfuscates until I can only see through a tiny patch of windshield. Crosswinds begin to tangle our way, to bump us around. We pass a streak of accidents. 2 fire engines, a rolled over car, dazed people wandering in the chill, a man walking a black dog nearby. Staying away from the rescue workers who are unfolding stretchers, racing to seek help. I press my foot too hard on the accelerator. My eldest son sitting beside me, and I go into a spin. He knows how to press traction control. When we turn right way around, we are both shaking. So you can kind of see the journey of that book, seeds that I sowed at the beginning. And then there's going to be, I try to convey a sense of the landscape changing, of going through a much flatter place and a place that was carved by mountains. So the elements of a longer book are really fun to play with. And, you've got all the pages out, and then you tinker with them forever. And there's a poetic theory that I actually studied in graduate school before I knew I wanted to be a poet, which is called the theory of adjacency, which means that many of you may know this, but that poems look different and draw different meanings from how they're arranged. And it's really fun to play with. So I'm excited to see what people think about this book when it comes out, because of the 3 different narratives that are going on. So I think I'll stop there, and Lynn's going to talk a bit about her method.
This is my full collection that was published last October. Great time for your first poetry collection to be released. Not. I actually do sections. I'll talk more about this later, but for example, these are pretty straightforward. Girls is the name of one of the poems in this section, but this whole section is about girls and young women. The middle section, and I'm going to read you this poem, Love Drunk, is about my failed marriage, first marriage. And the last section is very contemporary and was sort of post-2016, more dangerous for all of us. So I'm just going to read you the opening poem. One of the people who wrote a blurb for this book is the author Dominique Browning, and former editor of House and Garden magazine. And she said, and I had never thought of this, that this book was a memoir in poetry. And actually, I think she was right. So the first poem is called Biography. And it started out as sort of a smart aleck response, sort of for myself, to the part when you're submitting work where the submittable or the publication will say, include a biography of fewer than 100 words, sometimes fewer than 50 words. So I said, I'll write a biography. Here's the poem. I should also explain that I'm from Baltimore, Maryland, which is is either the northernmost southern city or the southernmost industrial city. So when I grew up in the 50s and 60s, it was a very segregated city. Biography. White girl, born in the city, grew up near the county line. Catholic school, Navy jumper, nuns in round white collars. Negroes, Only saw them when we went downtown, on the streetcar, after North Avenue when you looked around. There were hardly any white faces. When the school day was done, the bus filled up with teenagers heading deeper into the city, their school books stacked under their arms. The boys gave up their seats to the girls. I breathed the air of segregation in, taking it in, hardly knowing how it worked in this border state city of unstated rules, takeout only, segregated pools, separate schools, public or private, secular or parochial, separate movie theaters, separate stores. I graduated from saying colored people to Negroes, still everything stayed separate. Brown-skinned bus drivers, trash men, busboys, day cleaning ladies, white teachers, doctors, priests, Girl Scout leaders, hairdressers. My black and white TV world, Nat King Cole, Eartha Kitt, small figures with big, rich voices coming from our Sylvania. They looked so small. That was the air we took into our lymphatic vessels, our blood, our reproductive organs. It was our field vision. It would be years before we'd awake or refuse to see what we had not sensed, a system behind the screen. So that sets up this whole collection as about what it's like to grow up in this segregated city and really not understand it, and then come to an understanding of it, and then come to a critical eye towards it, and to begin to, and then we move into the 60s where there's a lot of political activism. There's a lot of that in the poems, where everything the wheels kind of go off everything. The rules are tossed out the window, but it's an exciting time to be alive. At the same time, it's a time that old customs and old institutions are not working anymore. So this is a middle poem from the section called Love Drunk, and this is that poem by that title. Love Drunk. We made our vows in the Lady Chapel. The reception was in my family's house. 50 of us crammed into the small rooms.
Sorry.
50 of us crammed into the small rooms I grew up in. We drank too much champagne, the Veuve Clicquot you chose. My mother whispered to us it was time to leave the party for our weekend honeymoon at your brother's cottage out in the valley. I threw my bouquet from the top of the staircase. Your brother's girlfriend caught it. I wonder if she knew all along he was gay. We slept on cotton sheets he had dyed red on the stove. Our life together faltered, then quickly frayed. It seemed so long while we lived it. My memory is blurry, vague, with necessary omissions, except I remember the tart, crisp champagne, our rich wedding cake, devil's food iced with buttercream, the cool sheets on our first marriage bed, waking up and staring into your ice blue eyes, knowing we couldn't turn off that road we'd set out on. So I'm just going to read the last poem, which is a poem in a much older voice. And this collection is 110 pages long, so it's pretty sizable. This one is called Walking at Day's End. Explain to me how the sea puts parentheses around the years since my father held my waist. We jumped the waves, and he sang off key to me. So much time has stacked up, but I walk along at low tide, the water here dotted with bits of red seaweed. Feel only the water and the sand. Walk over shells of small crabs or parts of their legs till the sea laps up again and there is only foam at the water's edge. Show me why the sea is so much like old words on the page, why I can read and reread a poem, its meaning constant, text embedded deep in my neurons, though life whirls me from single to married, from childless to prima gravida, to mother of two grown. off in the world. So what I was looking for there was a sort of closure. We've come from childhood and adolescence and young adulthood to a different time of sort of looking back and assessing and ruminating, really. So that was, and so my method really was to pour over these, and I think I knew that last poem was going to be the last poem all along. Originally, I thought that the first poem was going to be Dancing at Montebello, which is a short poem, but I liked the title, but I didn't think it was a good beginning poem. It didn't set the tone. So, where are we? I'm looking at time. Oh, I was going to talk a little bit. I just want to talk briefly about sections and give you some examples. This is a book by an Irish poet, Mary Maddock, and it's called The Egret Lands with News of Other Parts. And she has many sections in this book, and the book is 86 pages. She has 6 sections, and here are the titles: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So that's one way to do it. This one is more intriguing to me. This is Martín Espadas, who is going to be reading at the festival. Latest book, Floaters. And I love this book, first of all, but I love the section titles. There are fewer sections here. This is a somewhat shorter book. It's 76 pages. There are four sections: Jumping Off the Mystic Tobin Bridge, Asking Questions of the Moon, Love Song of the Kraken. Kraken was a mythical sea creature. And the last one, Morir Sonando. He has extensive notes. But this is a different way to do it. These are arranged, really, the whole section in Jumping Off the Mystic Tobin Bridge. I'll just read you the titles of a couple of the poems. Jumping Off the Mystic Tobin Bridge. Floaters. Ode to the Soccer Ball Sailing Over a Barbed Wire Fence. That's about some kids who are undocumented people coming from another country and are being detained, and these boys have one soccer ball and they are kicking it around in this barbed wire fence enclosure. Boxer wears America First shorts in bout with Mexican, finishes second. It's about a boxing match. I Now Pronounce You Dead, and so on. So these, he has the best titles. The Stoplight at the Corner Where Somebody Had to Die, Death Rides the Elevator in Brooklyn. So I think one can be as creative as one wants to be with section titles, but they can really guide the reader, which is something to think about. And the reason that I had sections is this wonderful Irish poet, Joan McBreen, read my manuscript, and she said, "You need sections. I like 3. 3 is a good number." And so, she said, "Oh, I don't like this section title." I kept getting feedback from her. It was really wonderful because it forced me to try to corral the poems, and I reordered them as well. Where are we, Heather? Just put down my list.
Yeah, so we were going to talk now about closing poems in different ways we've done them. So this is a collection of mine called Leaving Santorini. And I took that picture, but someone helped me make it look better. And just to pick up on what Lynn said, sending out your work to friends or trusted readers is really important. And I'm very grateful to Lynn because she's been a really wonderful reader for me for a long time. And so I had this book, I love islands. So I was going to have 2 parts. And one part was going to be about leaving Santorini, a place I went. And the other part was going to be about another island I love, Ireland, where Lynn and I have also been. It's called Visiting Lissadell. So those were my 2 sections. And then I had these poems about my mom when my mom passed away. And I sent this to a poet I really admire. That's another thing. If there's somebody you really admire, like I love this poet, Carol Muskie Dukes. And I just wrote to her cold and said, I love your work. Could I send you some poems? And she was like, sure. So people are often more generous than you would think. I mean, sometimes people don't always do that, but it's worth a try. So she said, you know what, you need you need 3 sections. She's also a believer in the 3 sections rule. So she had me break out the poems about my mom and call them, they're in a section, part 1, called Easter Alone. So it was Easter Alone, then Leaving Santorini, and then Visiting Lissadell. And as you can tell, I love wordplay. So I loved, the visit and the Lissadell and the leaving and the Santorini. And originally I was going to call the poem that I thought tied this whole book together. The poem is called Island Dream Songs. And that's what I was going to call the whole book until Carol Muskie-Duke said, yeah, that's not a good title at all. You need something else. So I think she helped me to see that particularity really matters, like, a concrete place and time that we all learn, and, creative writing. So, but I liked this poem, and I thought that it captured what I wanted to about. This is a book about journeying and traveling and then coming home. So Island Dream Songs. Something about the way the water laps the shore, the way the boat slips into a dock, the plane finds a runway on a narrow slit of land. Something about islands captivates me. It's not the feeling of being a prisoner, rather the setting free. The remoter, the better. The sense of escape, of tranquility, of being away from the world, close to eternity. The way water circles land, reminding us of the simplicity and clarity of being alone on an island. No man is an island, no woman either. Yet, I want to remember this, all of this, as I close my eyes just before the last descent.
Okay, I'm going to read a final poem from my chapbook. And by the way, I didn't mention this before. The cover of we're talking about art on the front. This is a painting that a friend of mine did, copied from a painting by a well-known Provincetown artist. His name was Herman Merrill, and he lived in Baltimore and in Provincetown. So I've depended heavily on my friends. This is an old photograph. I don't know who took it, but I'm in this picture with a rose in my teeth. It's a fake rose. And another friend who's a graphic artist did the cover for me, put it together. So this is called Baltimore Girls, which is obvious, and that was a title that I came up with after sending this manuscript out several times to different places, and then I thought, I should call it Baltimore Girls, and I think I've got a picture of us somewhere. And so it came together that way. And the last poem is called, and it's all about girls. It's about roommates and a girl who was using an eyelash curler before the nun came back into the classroom and she got in trouble, and about the night that the speaker, who would be me, stayed home right after Kennedy was assassinated, and about her cousin, and about her childhood playmate who got early dementia, and about crabbing with her father. That would all be me. But this last poem is it's really a memory of somebody I knew. It's called Susie in Midsummer. Not exactly a beauty, but you couldn't take your eyes off her. Dark hair, clear skin, tanned year-round, eyes lined with kohl. She favored caftans or long empire waist frocks. In summer, her narrow feet were encased in Greek sandals, her golden arms ringed with silver bangles. Husky-voiced, with an easy laugh, she drew to her every man in sight. When one of them won her for a month or two, the rest stepped back, petitioned to be her friend, would do anything to stay in that golden orbit. I used to be heavier, she confessed, but I owe this. She gestured from slender neck to painted toenails, to wine, beer, coffee, and she held up a tightly rolled joint, slid it between her lips, accepted a light. She played a field of unattached males, then at last settled into domesticity, Upper West Side style. Moved in with a New York radio DJ, honey-voiced, like her, only in a deeper register. She acted off-Broadway, knew where theater people supped late nights, wove macrame that found its way into a museum. Maybe she married the radio guy, lived happily or not, as so many of us who married and divorced, not knowing the odds. I could probably find her now. It's so easy with the internet, unless someone wants to erase herself from the databases, change her name, win no prizes, publish nothing, refuse to embrace social media, unless she is not a daughter who survives her parents, or a sibling, unless she becomes a non-person online, even if a somebody to neighbors, co-workers, children, maybe even grandchildren who point to photos in old leather-bound albums, asking, Glammy, who's the lady with the dark hair and the bracelets sitting in the lounge chair, holding the tall, frosty glass? Let me be clear. I don't want to find Susie. Only want to remember that night at someone's parents' house when they were away. We commandeered the kitchen, concocted vegetarian salads, opened beers, bottles of Chianti. She watched the men watching her. I saw it all. Her pheromones, her pull on all of us that midsummer, her laughter spilling from her to us, overflowing the porches, the deck, running loose down suburban streets. So I felt like that was really just that notion of, I want to remember her, I don't want to talk to her. I want to remember that moment. I want to remember that slice of that summer. So it's a fairly compact collection. It was easier to organize by far but could be a section of a longer book. Like you could take 3 chapbooks if they were about enough related to each other, and put them all together and have a full-length collection. Questions? Do we have questions? First of all, if you don't have questions, we've got more. But we did want to remind you that we're going to take questions now if anyone has a question, and if you want to be on our mailing list, we're planning some more in-depth workshops, which are really nitty-gritty about how to choose potential publishers, what it's like, how to do it, how to not get discouraged. That's hard. We have our email addresses and our phone numbers in the chat, and you should get in touch with us if you want to be on our mailing list. Do we have questions? You'll have to unmute yourself, Pat. Pat, do you have a question? Pat Hale? You're muted.
I know.
Okay, you're not.
Hi, what do you think about, it seems like books now are very focused. Is it just my imagination, or have things gotten very focused?
I think it really depends on the writer. One of my favorite poets, it was a colleague at Wellesley College for just a few years, because he's in his 90s now, is David Ferry. And one of his books that I love is called Bewilderment. He won I think a National Book Award for the collection. One whole section of it are translations from Latin poets, Catullus and others. Another section is about his wife, who at the time had begun to suffer from dementia, and how disorienting and bewildering, in fact, it was. That became the title of the book. The last section is about observations and people he encountered, I think by working in like a soup kitchen in Cambridge. So each section had a commonality of theme, but to think that you would have translations from classical Latin poets in the same collection with poems about your wife, who doesn't seem to be the person that you loved, is just not in there or accessible to you, but it works. So I think if you're a good enough poet, you can break those rules. I think Frank Bedard breaks those rules all the time. I think you do see a lot of like, these are the poems I wrote like after my mom died, or these are the poems I wrote after, I spent a year in Prague, or, but
Yeah.
that,
Here's 100 poems about bears.
yeah, well, 100 poems about bears. Well, that could probably work if you were a good enough poet. I wouldn't try it.
Yeah, I think it also depends like where you want to send it. Like, some publishers seem to look for more niche things and some are more generalist. So I think it really depends.
Yeah, that brings up a good point, which is if you're going to submit to a publisher cold as opposed to doing a contest, you should you should go onto their website, you should see who some of the poets are. You should either buy them or you can do what I do, which is check them out of the Minuteman Public Library Network, or wherever you are. I mean, whatever your library network is in Massachusetts, or make a purchase request at your local public library, because often they will do that. They will buy those, and see and get a feel for those poems. Because there's a press called Button Press, and I quite like some of their stuff. But I would never submit there because their stuff is way too funky and out there for me. I don't think they would be interested in the kind of stuff I write. But I've recommended that publisher to younger writers or edgier writers than myself. I don't consider myself an edgy writer.
Looks like we have another question. Kat? You want to ask your question?
Hi, what a great panel. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So I'm a pretty new poet, of my age, and I'm trying to figure out. I love the collection that you mentioned by Jeffrey Harrison. I had the pleasure of seeing him read at the Hillstead Poetry Festival a couple years back, and he read from that book, and it's wonderful. But my question is, like a lot of writers or poets, we all have our obsessions, or at least I do.
Oh, yeah.
My worry is I don't want to pound my reader over the head with the same thread of theme again and again and again. And yet, like many of us, I'm perhaps writing, I wonder how much I'm writing the same poem again with a different face. And when that needs to stop, when someone needs to tell me just stop it already, or whether that's okay, especially if it's about something such as what Mr. Harrison wrote about his brother. So if you take something that's traumatic that you're writing about, when do you know that you've overwritten about it, and when is it okay to have a section of those poems in a collection? I don't know if I've worded this very well, but
yeah, I think that's a really important thing. And I definitely look back sometimes, I'm like, oh no, I wrote that poem again. Like, there it is. Like, I do not need that poem anymore. Like, we're just going to put that away. But it depends what you're writing out of, and I think that's where revision comes in. Like, I wrote a sequence of poems when I actually left an abusive marriage, and it's called My Wedding Dress. And I wrote them all like in the span of a year, and they're all very intense and very dark. And my students love them because they're so dark. But I realized that, I was kind of writing my way through that. And then sometimes I still return to that and I write a poem about it. And I'm like, yeah, I'm kind of done with that. So I think the trick is, if it's something that's important to you, like, you need to honor that. It's important. And that's where you can revise and look at them together, maybe do the method of printing them all out and looking them on the table and seeing how they fit together. And then I think the trick is making it connect to your reader. Like, why would that be something that a reader would care about? And often, and I'm not saying that like, well, why would someone care? But like, we do care. Like, it's just that finding that link. Because I think if it's important to the writer, it will become important.
I think that we really didn't have a chance to talk about this at all, but the whole editing process and the revision process and the line by line by line by line reexamination of stuff has to be done well before you put everything together. I mean, that's not to say that it's done while you're pushing those papers around on the dining room table, but but there has to be a final stage where you go through, well, as Joan McBreen, the Irish poet I referenced before, is a good friend of, and a very generous critic for Heather and me both. He says, you take a piece of paper, a white piece of paper, and you go through that poem line at a time. Can you get rid of any of these words? Here. I mean, that is really micro editing. But sometimes when you do that, you think, and I just saw a phrase that I've used in 2 poems, and I was like, I should have caught that. I don't like the way something like she found her way, she did something, made a macrame that found its way into a museum, and I used that same found its way into somewhere else, not in this collection, and it's killing me because now I can't change. But I think if you think about, like, Robert Lowell wrote he was obsessed. Read some of his books. It's all about the same thing. Sylvia Plath, all about the same thing. Anne Sexton, all about the same thing. So I think sometimes the obsession can create a unifying theme. The question is each poem coming at it from a different angle? I thought there was something else I wanted to say too, but I can't remember. But that's a great question.
Yeah, it's really important.
Yeah, it's good to have an obsession. I mean, the thing is, after you write about it, and you're done, then what do? You have to find some other way to deal with that.
But that's an interesting thing you said about, like, not wanting to knock your reader over the head. Like, I'm trying to think of a book I've read where I felt that way, and I can't think of one.
It's sucked into, well, I do, a rupee. I don't like groupie stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Menstruation are so boring to me. But some students, young people,
Yeah.
read stuff. And I'm like, you want to read some really good stuff? Read Alice Notley.
Yeah, that's true. But I think it really depends where you want to connect with your reader.
Yeah. Well,
we're approaching the deadline, folks. So thank you. Why don't we put in the chat the links to or the documents for Heather and Lynn in case people want to read more about them.
Yeah, we also we had topics for another day, and the topics for another day were where to publish, contests, small presses, micro chapbooks, calls for submissions, a Facebook group called Calls for Submissions, Poetry, Fiction, and Art, print on demand, etc. So that's a whole other workshop. We'll get there. Thank you so much, all of you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for coming. Yeah.
Follow-up, we would love to hear from you.
Yeah, feel free to reach out.
Thank you for
Absolutely.
all the years.
Yeah, thank you, Mass Poetry.
Thank you, JD.
Oh, thank you. We have some closing remarks, I think, from volunteer.
Thank you all so much. Poets, if you have a website, social, or link to a book / chapbook, please put them in a the chat box now so that people can follow up with you. Can we get a round of appreciation for our poets? Don't forget to support the poets directly by following them and buying their books. There is plenty more amazing programming happening this weekend. If you're interested in attending more events, check out our website. You can also visit the virtual small press fair, listen to the Improbable audio tour, visit the Exhaustive gallery, and more. Please follow Mass Poetry on our social media accounts and sign up for our newsletter if you haven't already. The links will be listed in chat. Any donations go to support not just the festival, but year-round poetry programming. Thank you so